Names, literacy and intelligence. Saving our children. The most fundamental measure of intelligence is one's ability to know and use names to process information, because names and naming are wholly intelligible operations which a mind can either perform correctly or not. Today, mankind cannot function in accordance with simple conventions of names to the point where one would be hard-pressed to produce a book which correctly explains the simple convention of names. In short, mankind is not intelligent enough to even comply with the most fundamental principles of information processing. Names are used to parallel perception with conception, in other words, what we think about what we perceive. This is a process also called virtualization. We virtualize perceptions in order to determine our response to the environment in the most favorable way. The ability to virtualize perception is derived from biological evolution. Confusing names, an intelligible process, with the perceptible is schizophrenia. Determining if that schizophrenia is learned or congenital is determined by a mind's ability to learn to distinguish and correctly behave toward the one and the other, the intelligible from the perceptible to our advantage, and avoid what is to our disadvantage. Schizophrenia is the inability to distinguish the difference between these two. In short, it is the lack of being aware that naming is an intelligible process used to process perceptible reality. If one cannot acquire the awareness to consistently behave to each of these correctly, then to some degree that person will never actually acquire the full ability of literacy, nor will they ever be able to act correctly towards their environment. These people can be said to be insufficiently biologically evolved, or congenitally defective. We should, by now, be thinking of how to remove the forced learning of schizophrenia from our educational sources, for they are inflicting, upon our social structure, severe mental illness. They are incapacitating children which grow up to be dysfunctional adults. A child's mind cannot go through a natural process of growth when it is being forced into conflict with reality. So, right from the start, one can assume that those who actually believe that parallels do not exist are congenitally mentally defective, or at least the more educational achievements that they boast, while maintaining doctrines of non-Euclidean geometry, the more certain is their mental defect. It is a complete contradiction to use the equals symbol itself, parallel lines, and then claim it does not exist, a fatal mental flaw. Equal to, equals, denotes a process of true virtualization. It does not mean, in the least, that every operation with is denoted by that sign is currently perceptible. If the intelligible is missing in a person, then either the equation is wrong, or that person lacks the intelligence to reproduce it. This lack of intelligence is often the result of not knowing how to achieve a convention of names itself. Intelligence is the ability to virtualize, to learn to parallel perception with conception. We learn and teach this process of virtualization, in the hopes of producing life-supporting responses to our environment. Today, globally, we have computers processing all information. All of this processing is by binary recursion, that is, there are two and only two parts of speech, two parts of information processing. Information processing is simply the application of parsing information and applying to that parsed information what are called mathematical operations, in other words, building something different with what we parsed, like making a chair or a bed out of wood, steel, plastic, etc. We parse and then reshape relative differences to our advantage. Grammar systems are used to construct memory which is to our advantage. Memory is recursively applied as our behavior. The use of memory, from fiction to fact, is always aimed to our advantage. Therefore, the most fundamental system of grammar possible is by placing a one-to-one correspondence between the behavior of our hand and the two elements, the two defined parts, of anything. As we must parallel perception with conception, and learn the process, there is one system of grammar, our metagrammar, often called geometry, which is used to help teach and learn the distinction. We can learn the distinction, then, by using our own hand and contemplating our own behavior. Therefore, with your real or virtual hand, grab a straightedge. Produce the following figure. Slash. Notice that in order to produce it, you have to start from a stop, then your hand must proceed, and then come to a stop. This is our grammatical, universal, binary, off, on, off. This is as simple as it gets, where we start from a stop to where we end with a stop. Believe it or not, many people become confused if we embellish this like so. Slash. The two figures are not perceptibly the same, but they are meant to be intelligibly the same. The emphasis is being placed on the correlative. The stops are called correlatives. Nouns, limits, shape, boundary, container, etc., while what is between the stops is called relative, verb, material, substance, figure, distance, difference, etc., be that relative wood, plastic, water, jello, etc. Remember, we have only two parts of speech and we have to learn how to recursively apply them. This geometric figure represents the geometric naming convention. Notice we name only two concepts, and of those two concepts, one is a relative difference and the other is the parsing of that relative difference. Geometry, as implied in the Bible, and stated by Plato, is the only grammar system by which, if it's possible, to produce a perceptible paradigm, or virtualization of the intelligible. What is required, as in all our systems of grammar, is that we do not confuse the intelligible, what we wrote with our hand, and the perceptible. We must remember that we are virtualizing binary recursion. No system of grammar represents itself, it is meant as a form of virtualizing binary recursion. Thus, historically, those who claim that geometry is the product of straightedge and compass, is not only anthropomorphic, but a sign of stupidity. Every grammar is a method of making, in some manner, perceptible, the intelligible processes of our mind. By now, it should be clear to you why geometry is our metagrammar. It is the only grammar which can produce a perceptible paradigm of our two parts of speech in every intelligible detail, which also means it takes the greatest intelligence to use it. One can easily go off into the ozone layer of nonsense in common grammar, arithmetic or algebra, but presented in geometry, the figure is always exacting, and can today be demonstrated in what the computer allows us to do, demonstrate it interactively. Interactive geometry only means the mechanical recursion of geometry, the ability to display recursion better than we can do it with our own hand. Some of the more popular myths in our grammar systems today are the claims that there are different kinds of numbers, that is, that there are multiple conventions of names in arithmetic, or again, arithmetic, like every other convention of names is relative, a verb, not a noun. Every convention of names is independent of the operations performed with them. There is no such thing as real numbers, whole numbers, rational numbers, irrational numbers, finite and transfinite numbers, Euclidean or boson numbers. These claims are simply made by the illiterate. And again, that names have some kind of magical power, which only denotes the mind of very simple people. We use naming conventions to denote our behavior, what we mean. Those words are not anthropomorphic, they do not, cannot, in of themselves mean a thing. One must be clear, in their mind, neither part of a thing, its limits or its relative difference is a thing, and that means, when we name them, we are not naming anything at all. No noun, no verb, is a thing, in of itself. This fact was stated long ago, by what some call the founder of formal grammar, Plato, in a statement, the mentally short-changed, cannot comprehend. Socrates, here, then, a dream for a dream. For I too seem to myself to have heard some people say, that the first elements, as it were, from which we and all other things are composed, cannot be explained by reason, for that each several element by itself can only be named, but that nothing else can be predicated of it, neither that it exists nor does not exist, for that this would be to attribute to it existence or non-existence, whereas nothing ought to be added to it, if one means to speak of the thing itself only, neither must we add to it the term there, or that, or each, or only, or this, or many others of the same kind, for these are constantly varying and are applied to all things, and are different from the things to which they are added. But we ought, if it were possible, to speak of the thing itself, and, if it is a definition peculiar to itself, to speak of it without the addition of anything else. Now, however, it is impossible for any of the first elements to be explained by a definition, for it does not admit of anything else than being named, for it has only a name, but the things that have been composed from these, as they are complex, so their names, when connected together, constitute a definition, for a connection of names is the essence of definition. Thus, the elements themselves cannot be defined or known, but only perceived, but things compounded of them can be both known and defined, and apprehended by true judgment. When, therefore, anyone forms a true judgment of anything, without explanation, his soul indeed perceives the truth respecting it, but does not know it, for he who is not able to give and receive an explanation of a thing must be ignorant of that thing, but when he adds an explanation to it, then he is capable of knowing all these things, and may be perfect in science. Is it thus that you have heard the dream, or in some other way? Theaetetus, by Plato, Henry Caribon. 1861. We name relatives and correlatives, which, in of themselves are not a thing, they are the elements of a thing. Therefore, in order to use names, we must have the intelligence to comprehend our conventions of naming, and not claim, or believe, that the name is that which is named. Secondly, in this statement we find another great truth: what may be predicated of anything is wholly determined by the definition of that thing. If one cannot discern between the intelligible and the perceptible, they are then neither intelligent, nor sane. The simple-minded have never understood that, to the point that today, all school books are enforcing schizophrenia upon children, who cannot be expected, at their age, to be able to resist it. It is up to those who are not insane to help correct the current situation. One should also realize that there are two uses of any naming convention, universally, and particularly, in short, how to teach children to come to a convention of names in any particular circumstance. If one or both parties are incapable of arriving at a convention of names, then no communication can be effected. What is left is an uncivil state. If one cannot start with a definition of terms, one cannot conclude with a standard of human response. Ask yourself, have you ever known any educational system, any governing body, which taught anyone how to achieve and use a convention of names to effect socially conventional behavior? Or, in fact, is everyone trying to use names to flatter themselves, make themselves special and entitled? What are you doing to reduce the schizophrenic behavior of mankind? What are you doing to save children and the planet? A mind is potentially the most powerful life support system possible, therefore a mind has a well-defined biologically determined job to perform and well-defined physically determined means of doing its job. If one cannot, will not effect the foundation of that power, a convention of names, then one is simply not able to do the job of a functional mind. In conclusion, we can parallel the two elements of humanity and his environment in accordance with the perceptible and the intelligible. Can humanity survive if this parallel of the two parts of speech does not exist, as it does not exist today? Absolutely not. By definition, humanity does not yet even exist. Mankind has been repeatedly told, our enemy is not with the perceptible, it is with the intelligible. It is not gender, location, belief, Gates, Steins, or Trumps. It is with our own education and evolution. It is with what we can change, our own behavior. We can either become more functional, or we cannot. Psychology is commensurate with the principles of language resident in the mind as our grammar matrix. If one cannot function in accordance with its naming conventions, then one cannot ever be a sane and productive individual.
False words are not only evil in themselves, but they infect the mind with evil. Phaedo by Plato,